We now segue into the segment of the topic of climate change in business. Joining us now is Nicole Röttmer. Nicole is a seasoned visionary and values-driven leader with 20 years of experience in building organizations, creating services and tools, and securing business success. Her focus is on climate and sustainability, grounded in a track record of strategy consulting, innovation, operations, financial risk management, and change management. Nicole drives innovation at the intersection with the ecosystem with a strong focus on co-development. Nicole has co-built PwC Germany's climate group, Lumnix, the co-firm, and McKinsey's energy efficient service line. We welcome you, Nicole. Thank you.
For having me. I'm looking forward for an interesting discussion and absolutely for my check-in and conversation that I'll be having with Gail after this brief presentation. Thank you so much. So let me jump right in. I was asked to talk a bit about the relevance for business out of kind of what we're discussing in ESG and in climate change. I'll take climate change as one core element. Why? Because everything that we see happening with climate will happen with ESG more broadly. And let's jump right in. We have, I would say, two major disruptions in the ESG pathway. The first one is, historically, we've been talking about baselining. So what was the impact of a company that happened in the past? How much water did we consume? How much emissions did we have? What was our pollution track record? And we might have realized that we weren't very strong on that, but it was more like backward-looking accounting task. This has moved substantially into not just looking at the own operations, but also at the supply chain. And it has become a lot more sophisticated. So we have more standards in the room. The ambition levels are higher on reporting. We see in many geographies that auditing is required increasingly to these numbers as well. So that's one major step forward in the quality of any backward-looking elements and thoughts. Now where it's really getting interesting is when we move into the forward-looking. And the forward-looking is both on the side of commitments that I'm making as a business. So what is my contribution to biodiversity in the future for climate, quite straightforward. We had that previously in this session today. What is my net zero commitment? So suddenly I'm not just having a random figure of liters of water consumed or emissions that nobody really has an idea what it means, but suddenly we have some like an anchor, a mental anchor that is net zero. So do I and how do I commit to net zero, and what does that imply then for my own strategy moving forward? So that obviously can't be answered solely from a qualitative standpoint. So we're also moving into the financial relevance of ESG, and in this instance, climate very, very specifically. That has two dimensions as well. It has the dimension of if the world is changing and I'm not, what is the financial impact? But at the same time, if I pursue a net zero strategy, how does that make me as a business more successful? And all of these horizons that we're just discussing are evolving for ESG factors as well. We see a lot of that being driven out of the European Commission, but with the alignment with the ISSB and their double materiality discussion, we can expect that this is not where the journey is ending, with the SEC picking up more closely on climate-related and ESG-related disclosure. And looking at the APEC developments, we can for sure assume that there's going to be, let's at least say, a lot more dynamic, and what is more critical, a lot more transparency in the market on what companies are committing to and where they're heading. So the way that we typically think about structuring that type of work and thinking about making it tangible for companies is along what we call an ESG or climate house, if we move one slide ahead. So whenever you're building a strategy on ESG, please consider from the start that you might start with your impact, net zero point. You might start with your risk and opportunity analysis, but in the end, both are deeply intertwined. So it's fine to start with one or the other. Let me just give you an example. If I'm, for example, I'm committed to net zero and I'm doing a climate risk and opportunity analysis, what would happen if the world were changing, if we were transforming to a 1.5 degree world? My results will be drastically different if I'm already on that pathway or if I'm not. Just looking at increasing energy prices, carbon prices, but also availability of raw materials, that I would start to shield myself relatively in an SBTI or net zero pathway, but wouldn't if I would assume the world to kind of heat up more. So deeply intertwined, one of the best practices. Now, these were two theoretical concepts. Let's go into business relevancy and the money. I've brought two examples with me, one on transition, one on physical risk. The maps that you're seeing here is out of a tool that we're using. It's a HazMap. It just shows you which hazards will be increasing significantly under current climate modeling if we were stuck in a current stage of economic weakness, where we might turn back some of the measures we have for mitigation that have already been in place. We might not fulfill the regulatory commitments or the country commitments that have been made. So we need to detract a bit from where we are today, but it gives you a pretty good view on where hotspots are. And if I look at the Caribbean, obviously data modeling is limited, but just looking at the surrounding countries and regions gives you kind of a view that it's not going to be negligible, right? So just the hazard frequency of tropical cyclones, drought events, convective storms, will see levels that we have that are unprecedented. And this is 2030. For climate physical risk, we see the highest records on damage basically every 2 years in the insurance industry since a couple of years. So we know it's already going on and it's already happening. Let me give you some financial numbers as well. If we move one slide ahead, that's research from Swiss Re here. If we look at just physical risks, building on the research that they have been performing, we would expect for the world a GDP loss of 10%, and that's obviously without adaptation. For Latin America, which is the next region that is modeled, the GDP loss is estimated at 17%. So that is nothing that you would want to neglect, even if you would argue that your business might not be vulnerable to physical risks. But the economic damages that are increasing here and that are illustrated here will have broader economic impacts that will, in fact, be relevant for all types of business models that you can imagine. If we look at the transition side, when we talk about climate transition, we're basically talking about images as the next one. So reduction curves, if we move one slide ahead, please. So basically reduction curves, what is that illustrating? Imagine you have a major macroeconomic model where your input is population growth and GDP growth across the globe. That is then linked to economic sectors and economic sector performance and growth trajectories. And then on this kind of pathway that should be going up, we place basically technologies, regulation, etc., that allows us to decrease emissions while still achieving population growth and GDP growth factors. So there's a mix of regulation that's required, market demand, trends, etc., but obviously technological solutions that are required by sector to get us down there. So also transition risk is pretty clearly described. We're talking about relative price changes, availability changes, for example, for green steel, which already is a massive problem today. So very, very tangible changes in the economy that, if we look at the supply chain comment that I made on the first slide, will also hit a lot of businesses that do not expect to be vulnerable at this point in time. Making that tangible as well in terms of financial numbers, we did some modeling on the MSCI, just one illustration, and it's MSCI, it's global, but even on the MSCI on the next slide, on a 1.5 degree pathway, if companies that are currently in the MSCI wouldn't be acting till 2030, the kind of fundamental value loss that we would be seeing is some 6.5%. And that's a standard index with a lot of technology in it already, so a lot of balancing that is happening. Now, I've talked a bit about the kind of negative view and the bad news. Let me move to the good news a bit. If we move to the next slide, it's so easy to talk about it when we consider transition. What you're seeing here is what would be needed in terms of investments and in which sectors to allow us to transition. That sounds very technical and it might not be speaking to everybody. Behind that basically is an investment requirement of 3 to 4.5% of GDP annually till 2030. So massive amount of money that would need to go in there. What you're talking about as well is employment development. So if you look at modeling such as ILO, this is a business case that is positive. It's not destroying jobs, but it's creating jobs. And it is a case where there's some kind of obvious quick wins around infrastructure, hydrogen, potentially LNG, CCUs, etc. It also implies massive changes in a lot of companies as they're already in operations today. So changes in efficiency, changes in production models, changes in the way that we run our buildings. So building values, we've done some analyses on building valuation impacts, which are dramatic. And that comes in combination, let me just stop by that. It comes in combination with kind of physical risk that we'll also be seeing even if we are transitioning. So we've done a major study with 22 leading global insurance companies. And for them, this is serious stuff that it's already there, also on the physical side. So we are facing discussions on what do I insure, but on the positive side, also on where are new products that will be needed, both in health insurance, for example, but also product insurance moving forward. So why are we discussing this? We can still say in terms of, at least coming from Europe, the Ukraine crisis, the general economic downturn, is that still relevant? Are we still going there? We see money being extracted from green funds, for example. We see that funds are missing or not allocated appropriately. So is this still relevant, and should we care today? Not just sometime in 2030, but is it relevant for me today? And I would love to have a quick conversation with you on tipping points. If we move to the next slide, please. So you see tons of logos, lots of initiative. Let me break it down to you to very few points. Number one, we have 90% of global GDP committed to net zero. Even if we're not achieving that, and even if out of the 90, we might just have 60% of global GDP acting, we already see massive implications through supply chains that are driven by climate commitments. And we can surely expect that there will be tipping points where the valuation of assets is changing dramatically. The financial services clients we are working with are already starting to reprice assets, to review and redo their risk modelings to make sure that they are capturing that. And they are, of course, looking desperately at where are the growth opportunities if I need to start reshifting my portfolios. So 90%. Financial services industry. Second driver, we have about 50% of global financial assets under management and 50% of global balance sheets committed to net zero. There again, there might be delays. Not everybody might achieve their targets. But if you have 50% of the global financial sector in terms of money acting and asking clients and putting pressure, that has quite a significant effect in terms of creating transparency and also on the way that financial industries are understanding what is happening in companies and where and how their value and their risk modeling and assessment needs to change in the future. We've talked about regulation previously, so let me stay with ISSB for a moment. Just imagine the impact that it would have to talk about not just a water target, but quite specifically on a net zero target, a transformation pathway, money you want to spend to make that transition successful. We have talked about whether or not, as PwC, whether or not we can audit such plans, transition plans. Elements that we have for auditing these plans are, do we have a board decision? Is the money there to make that change happen? Are the investment volumes estimated well enough, or is it really offline? Are the measures that the companies are taking, are they generally just fit to make sure that the transition would happen that has been decided on? So you can imagine just the rigor of the dialogue that comes into the system globally, and that will define and redefine kind of the competitive pecking order within sectors and between sectors to some extent. I'd like to close with something really technical, just to give you a view of what we are talking about right now. And then I have 2-3 last highlights. So moving to page 10. This now is getting really technical stuff. Why am I showing this to you? We discussed the level of sophistication that is starting to materialize in the financial services industry, driven by stress tests, driven by financial sector regulation. A lot of that is really stress tests. And we do have a central bank network by now comprising more than 110 entities globally. I've never seen something to such an extent, who are driving scenario analysis for climate-related risks and opportunities. So what are you seeing here? This is one example of a company that how financial actors could think about dissecting a company. And they could do it by looking at sector requirements in terms of growth, technologies, looking at EBITDA implications. That's some of the modeling we do as well. EBITDA implications, if you put that company as it is today under stress of a net zero pathway and a high physical risk pathway, putting the company under stress under the assumption that they are investing and changing or not investing and changing, and then break it down to, is the transition path that they are laying out, is it good enough for net zero? And what specifically are the technologies that will be invested in? What are the resulting opportunities out of a financing or investment thought? And where are the company's risks? So what would I no longer want to have on my balance sheet as a bank, for example, that I might want to get out of and know before everybody else in the market is knowing this? So the dialogue that is starting to happen here is on a level that is unprecedented in terms of level of detail. Of course, it's always focused. And that's also one of the key messages that I would still like to leave with you if we move to page 11, please. So number one being, it's always around materiality. So everything we're looking at in the climate space, in each and every ESG space, is around materiality. The task, a lot of the reactions around in Europe, around the CSRD, where this is absolutely not doable to look at all ESG drivers and provide some type of a financial assessment. It's just simply not solvable. We don't have the data, we don't have the IT, we can't really deal with that. However, if you boil it down to materiality, what is it where my business really has an impact? What is it where I'm really at risk, or where are my major opportunities to realize in the end, it's a shift in the strategic discussion, but it is handleable. And that's at least our experience across a range of transformations that we were able to support. Secondly, it is a full business transformation. And I would love to leave that with you also as a kind of thought. If you want to engage on the journey, don't just leave it with somebody in sustainability. These poor people will be struggling hard. Think about it as, what are the business units that are concerned? What is the strategic outlook that is concerned? Build cross-functional teams from the start to have a learning in the entire organization and make it much easier to implement these types of changes in your entire organization, instead of realizing, and we have that as well, 2-3 years later, how fundamental it is what we're talking about. And please don't forget, it's a major opportunity. The entire debate has been changing over the past 15 years from, why would I care? Oh my God, the regulation is coming. Ooh, I realize it's a risk. And now it's tipping towards, it's a major opportunity. How can I be part of that opportunity? So much more positive spin that we're seeing in the debate, but obviously starting a race for value creation in the market, which is really interesting to see and which puts this topic on the C-level agenda.